The next type of performing media we're going to talk about are musical instruments. Make sure you have enough time to view this entire video because this one's a little bit longer than the other ones. So, musical instruments are mechanisms other than the human voice that produce musical sounds. 6 broad categories used in classical music. The categories are strings, woodwinds, brass, percussion, keyboard, and electronic instruments. The electronic instruments will be discussed later in the semester, since those are mostly 20th century inventions. And right now we're dealing with broader categories. Every instrument category contains a number of different instruments. So we have to ask ourselves, why have we created these categories? Why can't every instrument be its own instrument without being put into a broad category? Well, the categories simplify things for people who don't know a lot about music and help those of us that do to know more about the sounds being created. The categories are basically made because of how the instruments were first produced, what type of sounds they can produce, and many other reasons that relate to how the sounds of the instruments are similar. Just keep in mind that the 6 categories we're talking about in this class are not the only instrument categories in the world. Later in the semester, we'll talk about other American folk instruments and world music instruments that sort of fit into these categories, but are also in categories of their own. And let's just talk about the 6 broad categories that are most commonly used. Each of these instruments in these categories have a wide pitch range. Sometimes in playing these instruments, musicians decide that they're going to only play in parts of the pitch range. When they play in a specific area in order to control the tones produced, and then the tone colors produced, they're only using a part of the pitch range. This is called a register. So in other words, a register is a small part of an overall pitch range that musicians use to create different tone colors. Before we begin getting into the families of instruments, let's talk a little bit about the large ensemble that most commonly uses these instruments, the orchestra. We've already seen clips of orchestras playing, but just so we have a basic definition of the group, let's look at the slide below. The orchestra is basically a large ensemble or group of musicians playing a set mix of instruments that include the broad categories that were listed. The ensemble has been in use for hundreds of years and continues to be popular today. The conductor is the person, man or woman, who leads the orchestra, standing up on a podium in front of the entire group. And another important person in the ensemble is the concertmaster. The concertmaster is the first chair violinist that you see right next to the conductor. That violinist leads the musicians and performs solos with the ensemble on a regular basis. So, on to the first family. The first family are the strings. As you can see from the picture, there are 4 main instruments in this family. All of these instruments are made from wood and have strings strung on them at certain tensions. A bow, which is a stick of wood with horsehair attached to it, is pulled against the strings to create the different pitches. Fingers are put down onto the strings, and by changing the length of the string as it's bowed, you change the pitch. The violin, viola, cello, and double bass are the 4 instruments that are the main part of the strings family. The highest ranging instrument is the violin. It's also the smallest instrument of the family, as you can see from the picture below. All other instruments in the family were modeled after the violin. It was invented first and is one of the most commonly used stringed instruments across the planet. The viola is the second highest ranging instrument. As you can see from the picture, it looks almost exactly like the violin, but it is slightly larger, ranging from 15 to 17 inches in length. The viola has a dark, melancholy tone that gives it a lot of use in an orchestra. Many times when something sad is trying to be portrayed in a story, the viola will have a solo so that you can hear that sadness in the music. The cello, or violoncello as it used to be called, has a lower pitch range. It also has a mellow, calm tone color. You have to sit down to play the cello, unlike the violin and viola. The cello is held up not only by the person sitting behind it, but also by what's called an end pin sticking into the floor below. As you can see in the picture below, you can see that all 4 of the men playing the cellos are bowing across the strings to create sound, And they all have their fingers pressed at different areas of the string. That will create a higher or lower pitch depending on where they are pressing. Remember that the higher they play towards their face, the longer the string is and the lower the pitch will be. The double bass is also a very well-known instrument because it's used across genres. It's used in classical music, jazz, and rock. Pictured below is Esperanza Spalding, a pretty wonderful crossover artist who plays a lot of jazz and writes a lot of her own music. Check her out if you don't know anything about her. It's the lowest ranging instrument of the string family, and it's also one of the lowest instruments in the whole orchestra. Many of you might confuse the double bass with the electric bass, but if you take a look at pictures of the different instruments, you're going to notice obvious differences. While they are in the same lower range of pitches, the electronic bass doesn't function at all like an upright bass. It's no longer made of wood, and it's amplified through an amplifier. Whereas the upright double bass, especially in orchestral settings, has no amplification and is fingered, plucked, and bowed, whereas the electric bass uses what's called a plectrum. Two other common string instruments are the guitar and the harp. They're pictured below just so you can see what they look like. If you'd like to know more about those instruments, feel free to read about them in your book or look up examples of their playing on YouTube. So, listed below are a couple suggested listening examples. This is simply a suggestion if you want to know more about the instruments in the strings family. A string quartet is a piece of music written for a set of 4 stringed instruments. There are 3 of them linked below. It's the smallest string ensemble that is common, and it's a great way for you to listen to violin, viola, and cello and know more about what they can do. Keep in mind that a few of these excerpts below are a little bit strange and might not be what you're expecting. Especially the last one, Black Angels. But that one's there to teach you a little bit more about the unexpected sounds and tone colors that stringed instruments can make. Now it's time to move on to family number 2, the woodwinds. The woodwinds consist of the flute, oboe, bassoon, and clarinet families. These instruments were originally and still are primarily made from wood, though nowadays many of the flute family instruments are made out of metal, and most of the instruments have metal keys. The instruments were made to be blown into to create sound. Performers on these instruments use a reed that vibrates against the wood of the instrument. Seen below is a picture of the entire flute family. The most common are the flute, which you can see the arrow to, the second one from the bottom, and the piccolo, the one that's arrowed to on the bottom of the picture. These are the 2 most commonly played instruments in this family. The rest of the instruments, such as the alto, tenor, or bass flutes, are usually only played in flute ensembles or the occasional orchestral piece. Flutes have a very high register and can have a very piercing, shrill sound. Piccolos especially. They have the highest register of the orchestra and sometimes create very shrill sounds that stick out above the rest of the group. The clarinet family has 2 primary family members, the clarinet and the bass clarinets. Other clarinets, but those are the main 2. The next family is the oboe family. It is made up of the oboe and the English horn. The English horn is simply an instrument that is a little bit longer than the oboe, has a few more keys available to it, and has a wider, lower range. It has a much darker, melancholy sound than the actual oboe. Finally, the bassoon family also has 2 main instruments, the bassoon itself and the contrabassoon. The bassoon is pictured on the far left. The contrabassoon is the one that is curved in upon itself to the right. The contrabassoon is one of the lowest instruments in the orchestra and can create some very strange, dark, low sounds. Believe me, when you hear a contrabassoon, you'll understand what it sounds like. And if you do want to find out what it sounds like now, feel free to go onto YouTube and see whether you can find some good examples of contrabassoon playing. So you need to know just one more thing about woodwinds. All woodwind players, except for flautists, use reeds. A reed is a piece of cane attached to the instrument. When airs move against the reed, vibrations occur. Those vibrations, of course, travel through the air, reach our ears, are processed by our brain, and hence become sounds, pitches. that create music. A single reed is a woodwind instrument that uses only one reed, for example, the clarinet. It's a single piece of cane that's put directly against the instrument in order to have vibrations go through the reed into the instrument. A double reed instrument is a woodwind instrument that uses two reeds joined together, for example, the oboe or bassoon. If you look back at the pictures of the oboes and bassoons, you can see that they have two reeds that have been sewn together with a thread at the bottom and then put onto what's called a bocal or mouthpiece. Here are a few suggested listening examples. These are just for you to better understand what woodwinds sound like. Have fun with the second one. It's not often you can hear a bassoon quartet, especially of some sort of popular music. The first example is much more common, and it's a very beautiful piece. Now on to the brass family. This is the third family out of the 6 that we're going to talk about. The brass family is a family of metal instruments made out of long hollow tubes that are blown into. When a player puts a mouthpiece into the tube, they buzz one's lips against that mouthpiece and then push air through the tubes. The smaller the tubes, the higher the pitch range of the instrument. The instruments are the trumpet, trombone, French horn, and tuba. The trumpet has the highest pitched brass range. It's used in a wide variety of styles, including classical, jazz, blues, and rock music. It has a brilliant, flashy tone color, but can also produce melodic, beautiful sound. The French horn has a more mellow, rounded tone color than the trumpet. It's also known simply as a horn. It's used in a lot of romantic music, which we'll talk about a few more weeks into the semester, because of that beautiful, mellow sound that it has. The trombone is the only slide instrument in the brass family. As you can see from the picture, once again the player will use the mouthpiece to buzz and flow air through the tubes, but in this case the player can move the slide on the instrument to lengthen or shorten the tubing so as to create different pitches. Finally, the tuba, which is the lowest brass instrument. Once again, it's one of the lowest instruments in the classical orchestra. It takes an extreme, wonderful breathing ability to play this instrument well. So a few examples again that you can listen to at your pleasure of brass quintet and also of the Tennessee Tech Tuba Ensemble, which is a very famous tuba ensemble. Surprisingly enough, there are such things as tuba ensembles. It's a pretty fun thing to listen to. Family number 4 is the percussion family. You can see a picture of many examples of percussion below. The percussion instruments are instruments that are usually struck by hand and used primarily for musical effects such as crashing, booming, tinging, all sorts of sound effects. There are 2 types of percussion. Percussion instruments that are creating indefinite pitches and percussion instruments that are creating definite pitches. The indefinite pitch category is percussion with no definite pitch or tone produced when striking the instrument. This includes most of the drums and instruments that are hit by hand. Definite pitch percussion instruments create actual tone and pitches. This includes some drums like timpani or kettle drums, but mostly mallet instruments, which are instruments struck by mallets. Here are a few examples of indefinite pitch percussion: snare drum, bass drum, tambourine, triangle, cymbals, and gongs. And here are a few examples of definite pitch percussion, such as the timpani and the xylophone. Percussion is mostly used in large ensembles, but there are some small ensembles that are created as well simply out of percussion instruments, such as percussion ensembles. Percussion instruments can also play a soloist role in a few very rare circumstances. Sometimes composers write timpani concertos, for example. So below you can actually see the UTB Percussion Ensemble performing on stage at the TSC Arts Center, and you can see an excerpt from the Timpani Concerto by an American composer named Philip Glass. Both are fun to listen to. Enjoy them. Family number 5 is the keyboard family. This is a family of instruments that have keyboards, so it's possible to play many tones at once. The keys are hit with the fingers. When the keys actually go down and hit the board below, mechanisms inside the instrument are activated, which then produce distinct pitches. The piano is the most well-known of these instruments, of course. Pictured below is the grand piano. Many have seen upright pianos or electronic keyboards based off of pianos as well. The piano was invented around 1700 and perfected in 1850. It's the most common keyboard instrument and has 88 keys. As you can see from the picture, the keys on the actual keyboard are attached to strings inside the piano. When each key is struck, the strings are hammered and produce. The pipe organ is another very well-known keyboard instrument. As you can see, it's a much more complex instrument. It used to be called the king of instruments simply because of its size and majesty. It's commonly used in churches, especially the cathedrals of Europe. You can see that it has many keyboards, including a foot keyboard called a pedal box. These keys are attached to mechanisms that will then blow air through all of the pipes that you can see above, creating the pitches. The harpsichord is a historical keyboard used mostly in historical performances of music of the Baroque period from 1600 to 1750. We'll hear more of this music later in a few weeks. And you can notice that it has 2 keyboards and that there's art all over the actual harpsichord. Many old harpsichords are beautiful works of art that were painted by hand in the 16 and 1700s. These instruments, interestingly enough, are not capable of producing dynamics. Finally, there's the accordion, something that some of you will be familiar with since it's used in a lot of Mexican music genres. It's used mainly in non-classical music genres, such as Mexican musics, and in South American music, such as the Argentine tangos. The keyboard itself is attached to a movable bellows that helps to create. Feel free to browse through your textbook to find any of the examples of piano, harpsichord, and pipe organ music. There are plenty. Enjoy them. And below I've included a clip of some Argentinian tango to give you an idea of how the accordion is used outside of typical Mexican music genres. All right, we've finally made it to our last listening example. This is The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra by Benjamin Britten. Benjamin Britten was a British composer from the last 100 years. Very interesting guy. Feel free to read about him in the listing outline in your textbook or look up more information on him online. Here's some guiding questions for when you're listening to the actual example. First off, what instruments do you hear and when do you hear them? Use the video to help you figure out which instruments you are hearing by comparing the pictures that you've seen in this PowerPoint. Benjamin Britten used only one melody for this entire piece. You hear it many times. Why do you think he chose to do this? How can this use of this melody over and over again highlight the different instruments? And finally, think back to all the vocabulary and the different aspects of music you've learned about this week. Try to think about this piece of music in terms of pitch, dynamics, and tone color. Next week, we'll be on to different elements of music, delving further into the wonderful aspects that music has and why we really enjoy listening to it. Now it's time for you to get on to work on your assignment and the group discussion boards. I hope you've enjoyed learning about these aspects of music, and I will talk with you again next week.